Wild Health is about optimizing you. We use genomics, blood work, biometrics, microbiome assessment, many other tests, and a conversation with you to come up with a full health optimization plan. What's the perfect diet, exercise, and supplement plan for you and only you? The Wild Health podcast is about optimizing all of us. Here we cover the cutting-edge science that gives you the base to be able to apply the personalized plan we give you as a patient. To sign up as a patient, go to wildhealth.com. Or if you're a physician or health coach and you want to learn how to do this for your patients, we're happy to help as well. Wildhealth.com for all the information on becoming a patient or working with us.
What's up, Mike? How's it going?
Hey, Mike. How you doing? I heard you wanted to have a conversation about nerdy stuff.
Well, you know who to call. Hey, Mike Mallin, what are you doing?
Thanks.
It's a compliment, right?
I thought it's because you want to talk about protein synthesis.
Oh, I'm sorry. You didn't think that stuff was nerdy enough. I'm sorry. Yeah. Let's come back and can we do like a brief, like we could do like an appetizer of like convolutional neural networks, and then we can move into protein synthesis.
Yeah,
Does that sound?
sure. Yeah. How long do you have? 3 or 4 hours?
Yeah, generative AI into convolutional neural networks into an easy topic like protein synthesis. All right, well, protein synthesis I don't think is as nerdy as either of those other topics because let's face it, at the end of the day, it's all about getting jacked.
Right. There's one goal here. It's jackedness.
I still remember the time that you and I were driving with my younger one, and somehow the phrase ripped and yoked and swole came up in the car, and from the back seat we just heard this like awesome, like somewhat speech impedimented repeat of "I want to be whipped and yoked and swole."
I don't think I'll ever forget that. That was hilarious. And we must have laughed for like 20 minutes.
Well, it's from the mouths of babes, right? Like how many folks do we help take care of? Where they just want to be whipped and yoked as well. That's what they want.
That's all they want from us.
That's all they want. All right, so let's get into the nerdy side of being ripped and yoked and swole. I think we can't really ignore the nerdy conversation around MTOR, and we've touched on MTOR in the past in the podcast, but some requests to dive a little bit deeper and get into the mechanistic target of rapamycin, or MTOR, which I think kind of pops up in the longevity space, pops up in the body recomposition and lean muscle building space, and like I'm just gonna let you roll because I know you got a lot to say, but break down MTOR for me.
I don't know. Okay, I'll do my best here. So this is caveat, complex topic. There's a lot of research out there on MTOR, and it does a lot of different things. But we'll try to hit the highlights here, and I also want to try to keep it practical in the sense of like, where do we take this? Like, where do we take this information that we've learned about MTOR and turn it into? We'll start from the top: health, longevity, muscle protein synthesis, MTOR, or mechanistic target of rapamycin, which says whatever your interest is. So you mentioned is something called a protein kinase. So it's found in pretty much every cell in the body. And a protein kinase is an enzyme that regulates different cellular processes in the body. So it's going to turn things on, it's going to turn things off, right? It particularly plays a huge role in cellular growth, cellular metabolism, in protein synthesis, and a few other different cellular functions. So it's sort of like this central regulator for signaling pathways within the cell, and it responds to your environment. So something happens in your environment, it either upregulates or downregulates MTOR, and then your MTOR kind of tells your cell how to respond, right? Are we in a growth phase, or are we in a catabolic phase? Are kind of the two ways to think about it, right? So MTOR is kind of the governor chip, the accelerator maybe, for anabolism, for building, right? So when mTOR is turned on, we're promoting anabolic processes within the cell. That includes things like protein synthesis. It includes lipid production, and it also includes inhibiting catabolic processes. So we're turning off autophagy. So upregulation of mTOR is going to turn off autophagy. So that's actually part of mTOR. So there's two different types of mTOR. There's mTOR1 and there's mTOR2, right? And I don't think it's too important really to talk about the differences here. Basically, the mTOR1 is really more associated with the anabolic processes, and mTOR2 is more associated with like cell survival and cellular metabolism. So it's going to depend on things like cellular growth and multiplication, things like that. That's going to be more mTOR2. So if we take a step back from that and we look at why is mTOR important? I mean, obviously it's important because it's controlling whether the cells are growing or whether they're eating themselves. But when you look at excessive mTOR activation from a longevity standpoint, that's associated with things like abnormal cellular growth, which is hand in hand with tumor development, and pretty much every age-related disease. So as far as we can tell, mTOR is associated with cardiovascular disease, with dementia, with cancer. It has an effect on all of those things with excessive mTOR activity. So too much activation, we worry about all of those age-related diseases. Inhibition of mTOR can also be a bad thing, though. So too much inhibition of mTOR can lead to impaired tissue repair, reduced regeneration, and poor immune function. So people who are inactivating mTOR can, get infections more often. They can not respond. Their immune system cannot respond appropriately to vaccines or to diseases that you contract that you have to fight off, or you can just get really poor repair and recovery. Right. So I think in my mind, the easiest way to do this is to think about, anabolic states and catabolic states. Anabolic states are states of growth. Catabolic states are states of breaking down. We need energy. We need to eat ourselves, or we need to create more energy by taking protein and turning it into energy. So thinking of mTOR on as anabolic and mTOR off as catabolic is just the way that it naturally sort of sits in my mind to describe it. So
Yeah, I love it as like a TLDR, right?
yeah,
When mTOR is activated, you're building muscle, you're growing, and then when mTOR is down regulated, you're in a catabolic phase. You're using your stored energy or stored protein, stored energy. You're mobilizing your stored energy, right?
yeah,
And if it's the accelerator, or in my mind, I think of it kind of as like the on-off chip the on-off switch for muscle growth, right? You turn it on, you're in a phase where you're going to start building muscle. You turn it off, you're in a phase where you're going to maybe encourage autophagy and cell breakdown. So then, naturally, the question that comes to mind is who's turning the switch? And what are the actual, either environmental factors or nutrients or other players that tell mTOR, hey, all right, time to turn on versus slow your roll and
yep.
down regulate.
Yep, that's a great question. What's flipping the switch? What's the environmental impact? And so let's talk about activators first. So things that are going to flip the mTOR switch on. The first one that really comes to mind is amino acids. And when I say amino acids, I mean protein. And specifically, there's a branched chain amino acid, leucine, that seems to be really activating for mTOR. So about 3 grams of leucine, which is typically around 30 grams of protein, can turn on mTOR pretty much undeniably. How long mTOR stays on after protein intake is up for debate, and whether it's going to stay on for an extended period of time or not. Some people believe that it might not, but there's not really great data to say one way or the other how long it stays on. So amino acids definitely do it. So if you eat a meal with a certain amount of amino acids, you're definitely going to turn on mTOR. Another one is insulin and glucose. So along the lines of taking in nutrients, carbohydrates basically are going to turn on mTOR. They're going to turn on from two different mechanisms. Actually, glucose and insulin act in two different ways to turn on mTOR, and both of them will turn it on for sure. So you're going to get an activation of mTOR, this anabolic effect from insulin and glucose. So that would definitely works. There's also growth hormone factors. So insulin-like growth factor, which is sort of a surrogate to growth hormone, is going to activate mTOR, which just sort of makes sense, right? Like growth hormone growing, anabolic, mTOR activation, right? Nothing too earth-shattering there. The one that I think is interesting is actually certain cellular stresses can turn on mTOR as well. So things that sound a little bit more catabolic, or that you would expect maybe a catabolic response, actually activate mTOR. Those include hypoxia and DNA damage. So hypoxia is not getting enough oxygen to the cell, right? So the cell is not getting enough oxygen to create the energy that it needs, right? And then DNA damage, can happen lots of different things. Say it's from sun, say it's from radiation, whatever. But it does sort of make sense that evolutionarily, if you have hypoxia, there's probably some stress associated with that. If you have DNA damage, that's clearly a stressor, and you need to turn on these anabolic programs to fix those things that got broken in the cell, right? So I guess if you think about it sort of evolutionarily, it makes sense. In terms of inhibitors, there's several
Hey,
things.
can I stop you for a second, Mike?
Please do.
Two quick thoughts just on the activators. So, something I've heard talked about both in kind of the bro science sphere and in just like the general fitness community is the importance of leucine as an amino acid, and making sure that if you're kind of taking in supplemental protein in the form of like a protein powder, let's say, that there's adequate leucine content in that amino acid profile of the protein that you're taking in. You think that's probably the the link between necessary levels of leucine for activating mTOR? Is that the physiologic pathway there? Is that why leucine has like so much clout in the among its amino acid colleagues?
Yeah. It's because of that. It's a very anabolic amino acid. I will say though that you can't just take leucine by itself, right? So an anabolic stimulus without all of the amino acids that are necessary to create protein synthesis is not going to lead to the muscle development that you want. So while leucine is important, you definitely don't want a leucine deficient amino acid supplement or meal. You don't want to just overdo leucine and without regard to the other amino acids. So with that one caveat, but I do think that's probably true.
That makes sense, right? I mean, leucine's telling mTOR, hey, go get after it, but getting after it means building protein or protein synthesis, and if you don't have all the requisite amino acids, then that's not going to happen. And then conversely, you can have all the essential amino acids, but if you don't upregulate mTOR because you don't have enough leucine to signal it, then you're kind of not doing anything with those amino acids, or not doing as well as you could be. And then we're probably going to talk about fasting, but just looking at the activators, something just kind of clicked for me, which is, we know that protein's an activator. We know that carbohydrates are an activator in the form of the insulin and glucose pathways. But this is probably why fasting mimicking diets are like largely fad, right? Like there's basically no protein and super low carbohydrates for exactly that reason, because one of the activators I didn't hear was lipoproteins and fat regulating mTOR or activating mTOR.
Yeah, no triglycerides in there, right? Like you're not expecting fat to activate mTOR, and probably some of the advantage of a ketogenic style diet, right? In terms of fasting, not just fasting mimicking, but the benefits that you would have with mTOR inhibition as opposed to activation, which you would get from protein or glucose and insulin. You mentioned bro science. I'm just going to call out for 1 second that it's also popular to include a lot of glucose or sucrose or some sort of simple carbohydrate in a post-workout shake, which obviously includes leucine and lots of other amino acids, like Weight Gainer 3000 or whatever. This would also explain why that makes sense, right? So you're getting an anabolic stimulus with the insulin and the glucose as well as the amino acids. So you're maxing mTOR, to 11 or whatever, at least for some short time period after activity to try to create that anabolic response and the regeneration necessary after damaging your muscles from activity.
Yeah, maybe the only time where like a small handful of gummy bears might actually make some physiologic sense.
I don't think gummy bears are indicated.
Yeah, I'm not
Depends on the
recommending them, Mike.
depends on the sugar in the gummy bears. Maybe no, I'm not. No, I'm not even going there. No, just no gummy bears.
I'm gonna go find like a just plain old glucose, no high fructose corn syrup gummy bear brand, and you can start doing it after your lifting days. We're gonna just do
Okay.
an N-of-1 experiment. All right. Let's talk about inhibitors.
Inhibitors. All right. So the biggest ones here are that there's a and just to another caveat here. Sorry, there's more activators and there's no more inhibitors. Like the depth of these intracellular pathways is unknowable. It is so large. So we're definitely hitting the biggest ones here and the ones that are going to make the most sense to people. But in terms of the biggest inhibitors that are fairly obvious, would be the first one is really around caloric restriction, right? So lower cellular energy levels, and this can happen not just from caloric restriction; it can happen from other things, like for example, taking metformin, right, is going to sort of trick the body into thinking that there's lower cellular energy, and this is going to be regulated by AMPK. We've talked about AMPK in the past, which is AMP activated protein kinase, and that is going to tell mTOR to turn off, right? Like there's not enough energy to be building stuff right now. It's just, there's nothing there. So we're not building, right? That's basically the communication that's happening between AMPK and mTOR and turning mTOR off, which really makes a lot of evolutionary sense, right? If there's not energy to build, then why would we build? We want to conserve, right? And this is the conservation pathway. Other ones that sort of play along a very similar lines are glucagon and cortisol. Glucagon, released when there's lower levels of blood sugar. Cortisol is a stress hormone. There's stress going on for some reason because you're exercising or because you're running from a snake or a lion or a bear, whatever it is. We don't want to be building muscle when we're doing those sorts of things. That's not the goal, right? We want to be mobilizing energy sources, and glucagon and cortisol mobilize energy sources for the cells. So that's a hormone that's released in periods of caloric restriction or stress of some sort. The other one is sort of broad, and this is just in this realm of low growth factors. So that just means there's not a lot of growth factor activation coming from things like insulin, like growth factor, growth hormone sort of stuff, right? And that comes from all the things that we think about when we think about a catabolic state, and that's fasting, so intermittent fasting, prolonged fasting. That's ketogenic diets, right? So there's not a lot of growth factors being released when you're on a ketogenic diet. It's straight up calorie restriction. So if you're just restricting your calories, but you're eating, otherwise fairly normal 3 meals a day, you're still going to get a low amount of growth factors. And because of that, you're going to have inhibition of mTOR for the most part, which is why when you want to build muscle, you don't do a 3-day fast, right? Or when you want to build muscle, you don't reduce your caloric intake by 500 calories per day on an average basis, right? Those things are not consistent with building muscle for the most part. So that's sort of a intro to what's going to activate and what's going to inactivate mTOR.
Yeah, it's awesome. Thank you. It does not feel overwhelming, feels very practical. I think we'll maybe stop here and then come back and get into like a little bit more of the nitty gritty around muscle development, like knowing what mTOR is already, what turns it on, what turns it off. Let's talk a little bit more on a subsequent pod on muscle development and synthesis and how protein really plays a role there. Because I know that nobody likes talking about anything as much as they like talking about protein. So we can come back and do that.
Awesome.
Thanks, Mike.
That's all for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. And if you're looking for more, be sure to follow us on social at WildHealthMD and head over to wildhealth.com or wildhealth.com/premium to become a patient and experience precision medicine for yourself.